Well, an absolutely important day here in Dakar as the summit on the financing of Africa's infrastructure is coming to an end. Quite a number of pledges have been made by a number of financial institutions. For example, NEPAD, which is of course the African Union Development Agency, has been at the forefront, encouraging the private sector to come on board, but also trying to assure the private sector, given the perceptions of the risk in Africa, talking also about the importance of seamless trade in Africa. Very important issue, but you do need infrastructure as well. So a lot of issues are very interlinked, whether you're talking about electrification of the continent, whether you're talking about the issues also of provision of water. We do know that also it's quite important for the leaders, for them when they talk about Agenda 2063, to be able to achieve all these fantastic things. So Madam Nados Bekele Thomas earlier spoke about the issue of making sure that all leaders should show political will, all countries should make sure that their shoulders are on the will for Africa to be able to rise above all these challenges. But of course the issue of the private sector as well, very fundamental to get their buy-in. In fact, that has been a very key issue around this summit. We had also from the Senegalese president, who's also the African Union chairperson, Macky Sall, talking about making sure that Africa is able to create its own infrastructure, and also the issue of capacity building as well, very important. And the AU High Representative on Infrastructure Development, Raila Odinga, talking about the issue of saying that Africa doesn't need charity, and this is a time to deliver infrastructure. Khayelihle Khumalo, SABC News, Dakar, Senegal.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined from Dakar by our reporter, Khayelihle Khumalo, to give us a further update on what's been happening there. Khayelihle, it seems like big money is being talked about. I believe there are 69 key projects that have been showcased looking for funding.
Well, absolutely, Peter. So this is part and parcel of NEPAD's initiatives. As you know, that there's quite a lot to be done in Africa in terms of infrastructure rollout. You talk about the rail networks, you talk about the aviation sector, and it's been really interesting, during the course of the breaks, every so often, a number of the delegates, they were talking about how they struggled to get to Dakar. They had to connect from the continent all the way to Paris, to many other continents as well. So speaking to a number of challenges that are facing the continent in so many spheres in terms of economic development. Something that has been very important in this regard, Peter, is a very clear commitment by the African leaders to try and change the infrastructural landscape of Africa. The African Union chairperson, who's also the Senegalese President Macky Sall, also talking about the reforms of the global financial institutions, your institutions that are acted mainly from the Washington consensus, saying that at times some of the interest rates for the African countries are not really friendly. But something that has been very primary for this gathering, Peter, has been about a buy-in from the private sector to understand that the states cannot just do this alone. They do need the financial institutions. They do need so many role players in the continent in order to achieve all these ambitious projects.
Have you been able to get a sense of where the money is going to come from? Who are the main players in terms of providing the funding?
You have quite a number of players, Peter, the likes of the African Development Bank, which has been a dependable partner to so many countries, and some of their concessional loans, when you look at the interest rates, are very friendly to the African countries. So they understand the landscape, and it was quite interesting, listening as well to the Senegalese president as well, talking about the issue of making sure that the solution should be driven from the continent as opposed to outsourcing. But of course, so many international partners, the representatives as well from the European Union are also here. So many banks as well, they're here as well in Dakar. But of course, Peter, one of the most massive challenges facing the continent will have to be the perceptions around security. This very region where we are, West Africa, is quite notorious for the tsunami of coups that you have seen. So there has been an assurance by the leaders that the issue of perceptions, misperceptions, and of course security should be addressed so that Africa can have these trains, can have these water projects, can make sure that over 600 million Africans who are still not in their national grids are electrified.
All right, so these projects have been basically put out so that people can engage with them. Have there been other discussions taking place, roundtables, etc., etc.? What else is coming through in these conversations? I think you've given us a clue just now.
Well, certainly, Peter. In fact, day two today, you had so many delegates separated and engaging in what they call deal rooms to look at how they can make sure that some of these projects who are still in the early phase, how can they elevate them? Because it requires quite a substantial amount of money. That has been a very issue as well that has been raised in terms of the buy-in from so many sectors in the continent, but also understanding a very tough environment that the continent is finding itself in, making sure that some of these projects are very climate resilient in terms of making sure that we don't see any regressions during the course of the year. So it's been a very fantastic time and a very strong emphasis point as well from the NEPAD CEO, Nados Bekele-Thomas, talking about the issue of making sure that there are concrete solutions as opposed to having talk shops, making sure that we do see the deliverables.
I would imagine some of these projects are trans-border. I mean, we're talking about integrating Africa, bringing it together, and I guess some of these projects have to, by their nature, to promote that, be trans-border and trans-country.
Well, very much so, Peter. In fact, yesterday, Rwandan President Paul Kagame spoke about the issue of making sure that the countries should find synergies. When you talk about these linkages, when you talk about, for example, Southern Africa, where you do have, these bridges that are connecting so many countries in terms of the movement of goods. So it's quite important for the political will to be there to address some of the impediments. That has been a talking point raised by so many delegates here to make sure that they do find each other as well. But a region that has been cited to be doing a very fantastic work here will have to be East Africa. And of course, West Africa as well is not doing too badly. But of course, there's quite a lot to be done because when you look at the data from the World Bank, it speaks about that $171 billion that Africa requires at least per annum to try and address some of the infrastructure gaps in order to catch up and be a viable, prosperous, and a most well-integrated market.
All right. I know that this is the second financing summit of this nature. Do we have any idea how successful the last one might be or how successful this one might be in terms of delivering this funding?
Well, just a short while ago, Peter, the Senegalese Prime Minister delivered the closing remarks, once again making a clarion call to the financial institutions to come on board. And a lot of them really spoke about some of the risk factors that more often than not are always quoted in the continent. So, but there's a very clear understanding that Africa cannot afford to lose this momentum. So this is part and parcel of a premier initiative by NEPAD to try and galvanize this momentum and make sure that Africa is able to rise.
All right, Khayelihle, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, as always. And safe travels on your way back. Don't forget to come back home.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, that's our international correspondent doing the international beat for us. He's in Dakar in Senegal for the second Dakar Financing Summit, which is looking at funding various projects across the continent. 69 were on showcase there, and the lead funding provider, of course, the African Development Bank, which has supplied something in the region of, I think, 15 billion in the last 9 years or so. No, 9 billion in the last 15 years.